Question number 11. In line 30, the phrase, "these madmen," refers to whom? If you tuned into the last recap video, you already know the answer to this one, but we'll look at it as if we have no idea. So who are these madmen? The best way to find out is to look in the lines immediately previous to this, and if we go back to lines 28 and 29, we read, "But those who cannot write and those who can, all rhyme and scrawl and scribble to a man." We see then that he's referring to the poets. The correct response is E, poets. Just to quickly go through the rest of the answers, A, the speaker's enemies. There's nothing here to indicate this. B, Ward and Radcliffe. While he did mention these names in previous lines, this answer will only distract you if you're not reading carefully. C, medical doctors. Again, he does mention doctors earlier, but here he's referring directly back to those who rhyme and scrawl and scribble to a man, so it can't be C. D, charlatans. Charlatans are people who claim to know or be something that they are not. There's nothing like this in the entire poem, so this answer would probably only trip you if you didn't know what the word meant and you were randomly guessing. E, poets, is of course the correct answer. Question number 12. According to the speaker, these madmen, line 30, lack all of the following vices except what? Vocabulary is obviously important in this question. First of all, it helps to know that vices are immoral or wicked or sinful behaviors. Then let's look at the choices. A, greed. If we look in the passage, we see in line 32 that rarely avarice taints the tuneful mind. You need to know that avarice means greed, and since it rarely taints the tuneful mind, or the mind of a poet, then the speaker is saying that poets are rarely greedy or avaricious, so we can eliminate A. B, seditiousness. To be seditious is to incite or cause people to rebel against authority, and we can see in lines 33 and 34 that as long as he has a pen to play with, the poet never rebels or plots like other men do. So we can say that seditiousness is not one of his vices, and we can eliminate B. C, fraudulence. This word refers to cheating or lying or somehow deceiving someone. We see in line 37 that the poet doesn't cheat people. He leaves that, the speaker says, to Peter. And this is an allusion to the Apostle Peter in the Bible who denied Christ 3 times. So the poet is not fraudulent, and we can cross out C. D, vanity. Vanity as a vice refers to excessive pride in one's appearance or achievements. In this context, we would be thinking about a poet having excessive pride about his writing. And nowhere in this poem does the speaker specifically say that poets lack this particular vice. So D is looking like the correct choice. Let's check the last one. E, gluttony. Gluttony is the vice of eating way too much. And we see in line 40 that the poet is a perfect hermit in his diet. Hermits are people who live alone and typically live a very simple, modest life. So to say someone is a hermit in his diet is really to call him the opposite of a glutton. So we can cross out E, gluttony, and that leaves us with D, vanity, as the correct answer. Question number 13. In lines 43 through 52, the speaker attempts to do which of the following? This is another question in which vocabulary plays a big role. First, let's look at the 2 lines that come right before this part of the passage. In lines 41 and 42, the speaker says, "Of little use the man, you may suppose, who says in verse what others say in prose." He's saying here that you might think a man is pretty useless if he uses poetry or verse to say things rather than just saying them in the ordinary way or in prose. And then he goes on to say in lines 43 and 44, "Yet let me show a poet's of some weight, and though no soldier, useful to the state." So he's saying here, in answer to this potential criticism of poets as useless, that they aren't useless. They have some weight or importance, and even though maybe they aren't as useful as a soldier, they are still useful to the state. Then the speaker continues on to give some specifics about how a poet is useful. So let's look at the choices. A, recapitulate his argument. You need to know that recapitulate is to summarize or repeat something, and that isn't what's going on in lines 43 through 52. These are not ideas that the speaker has presented before, so we can eliminate A. B, recount an anecdote. Here you need to know that an anecdote is a story, and the speaker is not telling a story in these lines, so cross out B. C, offer a justification. To justify is to show something to be right or reasonable or good, and in these lines he is offering reasons that a poet is useful. So yes, he's offering a justification for poets. C is a good answer. D, draw an analogy. Remember that an analogy is a comparison, and nothing is being compared here, so you can eliminate D. E, chastise the reader. Chastise means to punish or maybe scold, and the speaker is not scolding us, so you can also eliminate E. And that leaves us with C, offer a justification, as the correct answer. Question number 14. According to line 47, the speaker finds value in which of the following aspects of poetry? The line in question reads, what's long or short, each accent, where to place. When you're talking about poetry and where to place the accents, you're talking about a poem's meter or rhythm. What's long or short, this can refer to how long or short a line of poetry is, or maybe whether a vowel sound is long or short. So here again, knowing the meaning of words is very helpful. If we look at our choices, the first one is versification, which is the making of verses or composing verses of poetry. And when you're composing poetry, what's long or short and where to place each accent is very important. Those considerations are part of the process. So versification is a good answer. Let's look at the rest. B, moral themes. Line 47 doesn't have anything to do with moral themes, so B is incorrect. C, metaphor. This is a literary term, of course, that refers to a particular kind of analogy or comparison, and there's nothing like that going on in line 47. Cross out C. D, rhetorical innovation. Rhetorical in this context would refer to writing, and innovation refers to the idea of coming up with something new. So this could be understood as coming up with new poetic ways of saying things, like coming up with new metaphors or imagery. But that isn't what's going on in line 47. E, logical paradigms. A paradigm can be a model or example or a particular set of assumptions. If you're overthinking this, you might think about the poet creating a pattern or something like that. But poetry doesn't have to be logical, so logical paradigms doesn't make a lot of sense, and it doesn't really fit here. E should be eliminated. And that takes us back to A, versification, which is indeed the correct response. Question number 15. According to the speaker, a positive aspect of poetry is its what? This is another question where vocabulary is key and close reading is always key. If we read through these lines, we see that the speaker gives examples of useful aspects of poetry in lines 45 through 48, and then in lines 49 through 52, he gives some exceptions. He says that if the poet were to do these things, that would be bad. So in line 45, he asks a rhetorical question. What will a child learn sooner than a song? Here he's pointing out that poetry is good for teaching children. Then he goes on to another rhetorical question. What better teach a foreigner the tongue? So here he's saying that there's no better way to teach someone the English language than with poetry or song. Then he continues, of course, with the value of learning meter and the long and short sounds or lines in poetry, and he ties that into poetry helping one to be able to speak in public with some grace. Then he lists his exceptions. He says that he couldn't think of a poet as worthless unless he were to use his poetry to praise a king who is really a monster, or if he were to use his poetry to make fun of religion or virtue, or if he were to write poetry that would please lewd or unbelieving people. And lewd means crude in a sexually offensive kind of way, and unbelieving would in this context be people who didn't have faith in God. So to sum up, the poet does useful things, and he can't be considered worthless unless he uses his poetry in certain negative ways. So with that under our belts, let's get to the answer choices. According to the speaker, a positive aspect of poetry is its A, moral value. The speaker doesn't specifically mention this as a positive aspect of poetry. He does mention in line 52 that the lack of moral value in a poet's work would make him consider the poet worthless if the poet were to write poetry that would please lewd people. This is a little weak, but still you might waver over this choice unless you know the meaning of the word didactic in choice B. So let's look at choice B. Didactic usefulness. Didactic has to do with teaching. So if something has didactic usefulness, then it's useful for teaching. And we know that the speaker says that poetry is useful for teaching children and also teaching foreigners the language. So this is a perfect answer, and we can choose it and comfortably cross A off our list and say that the correct answer is B. But let's look at the rest of the answers anyway. C, resemblance to other languages. The speaker doesn't say that the poetry resembles other languages. He says that poetry could help someone learn the language. So C is incorrect. D, uncomplicated nature. The only thing that might make you think this might be the right answer is the fact that the speaker does say that poetry can help a child learn. So you might think this implies that poetry has an uncomplicated nature, but that's really too much of a stretch. There are, after all, probably complicated things that help children learn as well, so we can't necessarily infer that poetry has an uncomplicated nature just from that. So cross out D. E, irreverent wittiness. No, because the speaker says that if the poet were to write poetry that made fun of religion in line 51, that would be one of the reasons he could be considered worthless. So the speaker definitely doesn't think of irreverent wittiness as a positive aspect of poetry. And you already know that the correct answer is B, and you know also that with so many of the questions as we've seen, the broader your vocabulary is, the easier this question is to answer.